Picture this. You're driving home late at night. The highway stretches endlessly before you, illuminated only by your headlights cutting through the darkness. You're thinking about what you'll have for dinner, maybe replaying a conversation from earlier in the day. Your mind is on autopilot because you've driven this route 1,000 times before. And then, without warning, something appears in your headlights. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that makes absolutely no sense. In that split second, your entire reality fractures, and you're forced to make a decision that could mean life or death, not just for you, but for whoever or whatever is standing in your path. Tonight, we're not just going to tell you stories about terrifying road encounters. Anyone can do that. Instead, we're going to explore something far more unsettling. We're going to examine why roads and highways have become one of the most psychologically vulnerable places in modern human existence. We're going to understand why our brains fail us in these moments, why we're so susceptible to panic and poor decision-making when confronted with the unexpected on the open road, and most importantly, what all of this reveals about human nature itself. This is a deep dive into the psychology of road terror, and by the end of this exploration, you'll understand why that ordinary commute you take every single day is actually one of the most cognitively demanding and psychologically fragile experiences you'll ever have. You'll learn why highways are the perfect stage for trauma, why our autopilot thinking puts us in danger, and why some of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in modern history all share one common thread. They happen on roads where people thought they were safe, but discovered they were anything but. Part 1. The cognitive trap of routine driving. Before we can understand why road encounters are so psychologically devastating, we need to understand what's actually happening in your brain when you drive. And the truth is far more disturbing than you might think. When you first learned to drive, every single action required conscious thought. You had to think about checking your mirrors, about maintaining proper distance from other vehicles, about when to accelerate and when to brake. Your brain was in what psychologists call a state of active attention, where every stimulus demanded conscious processing. But here's where things get interesting and ultimately dangerous. As you became more experienced, your brain did something remarkable. It began automating these processes, moving them from conscious thought into what's known as procedural memory. This is the same system that allows you to walk without thinking about each individual step, or to type without looking at the keyboard. Your brain essentially creates shortcuts, allowing you to perform complex tasks while devoting minimal conscious attention to them. This automation is incredibly efficient and allows us to function in a complex world without being overwhelmed by information. But it comes with a catastrophic weakness. When your brain is operating on autopilot, it's not truly processing the environment around you in a conscious way. Instead, it's pattern matching. It's comparing what your senses are detecting against a massive database of previous experiences and only alerting your conscious mind when something doesn't match the expected pattern. This is why you can drive for 30 minutes and arrive at your destination with almost no memory of the actual journey. Your conscious mind wasn't really there for most of it. Your autopilot system handled everything because nothing triggered the alarm that would bring your full attention back online. Now imagine what happens when something genuinely anomalous appears in your path, a figure that shouldn't exist in that context, a person lying across the highway, a child standing in the middle of the road miles from any civilization, someone in a clown costume blocking your path. Your pattern matching system has no reference point for these scenarios. There's no existing mental template that says this is how you handle a child in the middle of a highway at night, or this is the protocol for a clown chasing your vehicle. The result is what psychologists call cognitive overload, where your conscious mind is suddenly flooded with an overwhelming amount of information it's completely unprepared to process. This is why people freeze in these moments. This is why they make decisions that seem irrational in hindsight. Their brains have gone from operating at maybe 10 or 20% conscious capacity to suddenly needing 100% attention immediately. and the transition is so jarring that the entire system temporarily locks up. It's not that people are stupid or cowardly. It's that they're experiencing a fundamental failure in how human cognition operates under extreme circumstances. But there's another layer to this that makes road encounters even more psychologically devastating. When you're driving, you're not just a passive observer of danger. You're controlling a multi-ton vehicle moving at high speed. This means that your response to an unexpected threat isn't just about your own safety. Every decision you make could potentially harm others. If you swerve suddenly, you might lose control and crash. If you slam on the brakes, you might cause a collision with vehicles behind you. If you keep driving, you might hit whatever's in your path. This creates what's known as a moral dilemma under time pressure. And research shows that humans are absolutely terrible at making ethical decisions when they have less than a few seconds to act. Your brain essentially goes into survival mode, prioritizing your immediate safety over all other considerations, including the safety of others. This is why people sometimes keep driving even when they see someone who might need help. It's not that they're cruel or heartless. It's that their survival instinct has completely overridden their capacity for moral reasoning. Their brain has calculated, in a fraction of a second, that stopping or swerving represents a greater threat to their own survival than continuing forward. And once that calculation is made, conscious ethical thought doesn't really factor into the equation anymore. This cognitive vulnerability is precisely why roads have become such a common setting for unexplained encounters and unsolved mysteries. Predators, whether human or opportunistic, instinctively understand that people on highways are in a uniquely compromised mental state. They're not fully alert, they're controlling dangerous machinery, and they're operating under severe time constraints that prevent careful decision-making. If you wanted to create the perfect conditions for exploiting human psychological weakness, you'd be hard-pressed to design something better than a dark highway at night. Part 2. The bystander effect on wheels. Now that we understand why our brains fail us during unexpected road encounters, we need to examine an even more troubling phenomenon. The road amplifies one of the most disturbing aspects of human psychology, something known as the bystander effect. You've probably heard of this concept before. It's the well-documented phenomenon where individuals are less likely to help someone in distress when other people are present. The classic example is the case of Kitty Genovese, who was attacked while dozens of witnesses did nothing, each assuming someone else would intervene. But what most people don't realize is that the bystander effect becomes exponentially more powerful when you add the element of vehicular movement. When you encounter someone who appears to need help on a highway, you're not just dealing with the question of whether to assist. You're dealing with a complex series of split-second calculations about safety, legitimacy, and consequence. And here's where human psychology reveals something deeply uncomfortable about our nature. Research into highway assistance behavior shows that the vast majority of drivers who encounter someone in apparent distress will not stop to help. This isn't because most people are inherently selfish or cruel. It's because the cognitive calculus changes completely when you're in a moving vehicle. First, there's the question of whether the situation is genuine. Your brain immediately starts generating alternative explanations. Maybe it's a setup for a robbery. Maybe it's a prank. Maybe someone else has already called for help. These rationalizations happen automatically, often before you've even consciously decided whether to stop or not. Second, there's the practical concern about safety. If you stop on a highway, you're putting yourself at risk of being hit by other vehicles. You're also potentially putting yourself at risk from the person you're trying to help if they turn out to have harmful intentions. Your brain performs a rapid risk assessment, and in most cases concludes that the potential costs of stopping outweigh the potential benefits. This assessment happens so quickly that you're often not even aware you've made it until you're already past the scene. Third, and this is perhaps the most psychologically revealing factor, there's the issue of diffusion of responsibility. When you're driving on a highway with other vehicles around, your brain automatically assumes that someone else will handle the situation. Surely one of the other drivers will stop. Surely someone has already called the authorities. Surely this isn't actually your responsibility because there are so many other people who could intervene instead. This diffusion becomes even more pronounced on highways because you can't see what other drivers are doing once you've passed. For all you know, 3 cars behind you have already stopped to help, which makes your own intervention unnecessary. The terrifying truth is that this same psychological pattern repeats in every single vehicle that passes. Each driver assumes someone else will handle it, and the result is that no one does anything at all. This is how people end up stranded on highways for hours despite hundreds of vehicles passing by. This is how injured individuals lie on the road while driver after driver simply navigates around them and continues on their way. It's not that every single one of those drivers is a bad person. It's that human psychology, when combined with the specific conditions of highway driving, creates a perfect storm of inaction. But there's an even darker aspect to this phenomenon that we need to address. Sometimes the bystander effect on highways isn't just about failing to help. Sometimes it's about failing to report something genuinely suspicious or dangerous. Think about the implications of this. If you see something truly bizarre on a highway, something that doesn't make sense and might indicate criminal activity, your first instinct is often to dismiss it. Your brain immediately starts working to normalize the experience, to find an explanation that doesn't require you to take action. This is because taking action comes with costs. You'd have to call the police, potentially pull over, maybe give a statement, possibly become involved in an investigation. Your brain weighs these costs against the uncertain benefits of reporting something that might turn out to be nothing at all, and more often than not, it decides that the path of least resistance is to simply continue driving and let someone else deal with it. This is why so many highway crimes and mysteries remain unsolved. It's not that there weren't witnesses. It's that those witnesses experienced something their brains couldn't easily categorize. And rather than dealing with the cognitive dissonance and practical complications of reporting it, they chose the psychologically simpler option of moving on and forgetting about it. The research on this is absolutely chilling. Studies have shown that even when people witness what they believe to be criminal activity on highways, less than 30% will report it to authorities. The percentage drops even lower if the incident is ambiguous or hard to explain. This means that criminals who operate on highways, whether they're opportunistic attackers or organized predators, are working in an environment where the vast majority of potential witnesses will simply drive away without taking action. They've essentially found a vulnerability in human psychology and the structure of modern transportation that allows them to operate with impunity. What makes this even more disturbing is that we can't really blame individual drivers for this behavior. They're not making conscious decisions to ignore crime or abandon people in need. They're experiencing a fundamental limitation in how human cognition operates under the specific conditions of highway driving. The speed, the time pressure, the isolation, the diffusion of responsibility, it all combines to create a situation where even good people with strong moral compasses will fail to do the right thing simply because their brains can't process the situation effectively in the moment. Part 3. The psychology of anomalous ENCONTRS. Now we need to address something that makes highway encounters uniquely disturbing from a psychological perspective. Roads are liminal spaces, and that liminality creates a specific type of psychological vulnerability that most people don't consciously recognize. Let me explain what I mean by liminal space. In psychology and anthropology, liminal spaces are transitional areas between two more stable locations. They're the in-between places where you're neither here nor there. Highways epitomize this concept perfectly. When you're on a highway, you're not really anywhere. You're between locations, suspended in a state of movement where your only purpose is to get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. This transitional state does something strange to human consciousness. Research in environmental psychology has shown that people in liminal spaces experience a subtle but measurable shift in their cognitive state. They become more susceptible to unusual experiences, more likely to misperceive ordinary stimuli as threatening or anomalous, and significantly more vulnerable to memory distortions. This is because your brain recognizes at some unconscious level that you're in a space where normal rules don't quite apply. You're not in the safety of your home, but you're not in a clearly defined public space either. You're in this odd bubble of isolation despite being surrounded by other vehicles, and that isolation makes you more psychologically vulnerable than you'd be in almost any other environment. This vulnerability is precisely why so many unexplained encounters happen on highways. It's not just that roads are dangerous or that bad things happen there more frequently. It's that the liminal nature of highways makes people more likely to have experiences that feel anomalous or incomprehensible. When you combine this with the cognitive autopilot state we discussed earlier, you create conditions where people's perception of reality can be genuinely disrupted. They might see something ordinary and misinterpret it as extraordinary. They might experience something extraordinary and later convince themselves it was ordinary. The line between perception and misperception becomes extremely blurred in these environments. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Imagine you're driving late at night on an empty highway. You've been driving for hours. Your brain is in deep autopilot mode, and you're in that semi-conscious state where you're aware enough to operate the vehicle but not really present in any meaningful sense. Suddenly, something appears in your headlights that doesn't match any existing pattern in your memory. Maybe it's a person in unusual clothing. Maybe it's something you can't quite identify. Maybe it's just shadows creating an illusion of movement. In that moment, your brain has to make a split-second decision about how to categorize this stimulus. Here's where the liminal psychology comes in. Because you're already in this transitional mental state, because your normal cognitive processes are operating at reduced capacity, because the highway environment has primed you to expect isolation and emptiness, your brain is much more likely to categorize this anomalous stimulus as threatening or supernatural than it would be if you encountered the exact same thing in a normal daytime environment. This doesn't mean you're hallucinating or that the stimulus isn't real. It means that your perception and interpretation of that stimulus are being significantly influenced by the psychological state induced by highway driving. This explains why so many highway encounters have this dreamlike or unreal quality to them. People describe feeling like they were in a movie, or like what they experienced couldn't possibly have been real, or like they might have imagined the whole thing. These aren't indicators that the experience was fake. They're indicators that the experience was processed by a brain operating in an altered cognitive state. And when you try to remember and make sense of it later using your normal cognitive processes, there's a disconnect between how the memory feels and how your current conscious experience feels. But there's another psychological factor at work here that's even more insidious. The liminal nature of highways creates what psychologists call narrative vacuum. When something happens to you on a highway, there's often no context, no before or after story that makes sense of the event. You don't know where the person came from or where they went. You don't know the full story behind what you witnessed. You're just passing through, catching a brief glimpse of something, and then it's gone. Your brain absolutely hates narrative vacuums. We're hardwired to create coherent stories that explain our experiences, and when we can't do that, we experience significant psychological distress. This is why people become obsessed with highway encounters they've had. It's not just that the encounter was scary or unusual. It's that their brain can't create a satisfying narrative to explain it, and that inability to find narrative closure creates ongoing psychological tension. You'll replay the incident over and over in your mind, trying different explanations, wondering what really happened, unable to let it go because your narrative drive hasn't been satisfied. This is a form of cognitive dissonance, and it can be genuinely distressing, sometimes lasting for years after the original encounter. The research on this is fascinating and deeply unsettling. Studies of people who have had anomalous highway encounters show that these experiences often have lasting psychological effects that go beyond what you'd expect from a simple scary incident. People report changes in their driving behavior, increased anxiety about highways, recurring intrusive thoughts about the encounter, and sometimes even changes in their broader worldview. This isn't because highways are objectively more dangerous than other environments. It's because highway encounters exploit multiple psychological vulnerabilities simultaneously. The cognitive autopilot, the liminal space effect, the narrative vacuum, and the lack of social support all combine to create experiences that our brains struggle to process and integrate. What's particularly disturbing about this from a criminological perspective is that predators seem to intuitively understand these psychological vulnerabilities, even if they couldn't explain them in theoretical terms. Criminal psychologists have documented that highway predators often employ tactics specifically designed to exploit liminal space psychology. They create encounters that are ambiguous enough that victims doubt their own perceptions. They operate in ways that generate narrative vacuums where witnesses can't quite explain what they saw. They take advantage of the cognitive autopilot state to catch victims completely off guard. In other words, they're exploiting the same psychological vulnerabilities we've been discussing, and they're doing it with disturbing effectiveness. Part 4. The crisis of split-second moral dissociative. We need to address what might be the most psychologically complex aspect of highway encounters: the moral dimension. When you encounter something unexpected on a highway, you're not just dealing with a threat to your safety. You're often dealing with a moral dilemma that requires immediate resolution. Should you stop to help someone who appears to be in distress, knowing it might be dangerous? Should you swerve to avoid hitting something, knowing you might cause an accident? Should you report something suspicious you've seen, knowing it might be nothing? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're life and death decisions that need to be made in less time than it takes to finish this sentence. Research into moral decision-making under time pressure reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. We like to think of ourselves as fundamentally moral beings who will do the right thing when it really matters. But the truth is that our capacity for moral reasoning essentially shuts down when we're under extreme time pressure. Studies using simulated driving scenarios have shown that when people have less than 3 seconds to make a moral decision, they default almost entirely to self-preservation instincts. The ethical considerations that would normally guide their behavior simply don't factor into the equation because there isn't enough time for that part of the brain to engage. This has profound implications for how we understand highway encounters. When someone drives past a person in need without stopping, we tend to judge them harshly. We think they must be cruel or selfish or lacking in basic human decency. But what the research shows is that they're probably not making a conscious moral choice at all. Their brain has entered survival mode, calculated that stopping represents a potential threat, and overridden their capacity for ethical reasoning before they even consciously registered the decision had been made. By the time they're far enough past the scene to start thinking consciously about what they should have done, it's already too late to go back. This creates a psychological burden that many people carry for years or even decades after a highway encounter. They replay the incident in their minds, tormented by what they should have done, unable to forgive themselves for failing to help or report or intervene. But what they don't realize is that they were fighting against fundamental limitations in how human cognition operates under pressure. They weren't experiencing a moral failure in the traditional sense. They were experiencing a cognitive limitation that affects virtually all humans in similar circumstances. The psychological literature on this phenomenon is extensive and sobering. Researchers have documented what they call moral injury, a specific type of psychological trauma that occurs when people violate their own ethical beliefs or witness violations they feel powerless to prevent. This concept was originally developed to understand combat veterans, but it applies perfectly to certain types of highway encounters. When you drive past someone who needed help, when you witness something suspicious but don't report it, when you make a split-second decision that prioritizes your safety over someone else's, you can experience genuine psychological trauma even though you weren't directly harmed yourself. The symptoms of moral injury include intrusive thoughts about the incident, persistent guilt and shame, changes in self-perception, difficulty trusting your own judgment, and sometimes a broader questioning of your identity and values. These aren't signs of weakness or oversensitivity. They're normal psychological responses to situations where your actions conflicted with your values. And the fact that the conflict occurred because of cognitive limitations, rather than genuine moral failings, doesn't make the injury any less real. But here's where this gets even more psychologically complex. Sometimes the moral dilemma isn't about whether to help. Sometimes it's about whether your own perception can be trusted. Think about cases where people see something genuinely bizarre on a highway, something that might indicate criminal activity, but is ambiguous enough that they're not sure. Maybe they saw someone dragging something across the road. Maybe they saw a person behaving strangely. Maybe they saw something that just felt wrong, but they can't quite articulate why. In these situations, the moral dilemma becomes, should I report this knowing I might be wrong, knowing I might be wasting police resources, knowing I might look foolish if it turns out to be nothing? Research shows that people are significantly less likely to report ambiguous situations compared to clear-cut emergencies, and this tendency is amplified dramatically in highway contexts. Your brain essentially performs a cost-benefit analysis, where the costs of reporting being wrong, potential embarrassment, wasted time, possible complications, seem to outweigh the uncertain benefits of reporting something that might or might not be important. This is compounded by social factors. We live in a culture where people are often criticized for being overly paranoid or seeing danger where none exists. This social pressure makes people even less likely to report ambiguous situations because they're afraid of being judged for overreacting. The result is that highways become zones of moral ambiguity, where people routinely witness things that might be significant but choose not to act because they can't be certain, and the costs of being wrong feel too high. This creates an environment where genuine crimes and emergencies go unreported simply because they occurred in circumstances that made witnesses doubt their own perception or worry about the social consequences of speaking up. From a societal perspective, this is catastrophic. It means we have a transportation infrastructure where potential witnesses are systematically discouraged from reporting suspicious activity by a combination of psychological factors and social pressures. What makes this even more troubling is that there's significant evidence showing that early reports of suspicious activity on highways often turn out to be crucial in solving serious crimes. That ambiguous thing someone saw but dismissed as probably nothing frequently turns out to be evidence of kidnapping, assault, drug trafficking, or other serious criminal activity. But because our psychological makeup and social structures discourage reporting ambiguous situations, this evidence often comes to light only after the fact, if at all. We're essentially allowing our highways to function as hunting grounds for predators, because we've created an environment where witnesses second-guess themselves into silence. Part 5. The phenomenon of dissociative states and highway hypnosis. There's one more psychological phenomenon we need to explore to fully understand why highways create such unique psychological vulnerabilities. It's something that millions of people experience regularly but few understand or even recognize. It's called highway hypnosis, and it represents one of the most dangerous altered states of consciousness that people routinely enter without even realizing it. Highway hypnosis, also known as white line fever or driving without attention mode, is a trance-like state that occurs during long periods of highway driving, where the conscious mind becomes essentially disconnected from the act of driving itself. This isn't the same as the cognitive autopilot we discussed earlier, though they're related. Highway hypnosis is a deeper state where not only are you not consciously controlling the vehicle, you're also not consciously processing your surroundings at all. People in this state can drive for dozens of miles with essentially zero conscious memory of the journey. They might suddenly snap back to full consciousness and realize they have no memory of the last 20 minutes of driving, no recollection of exits they passed or turns they made. It's as if they were literally absent from their own experience for that period of time. The psychological mechanism behind highway hypnosis is related to something called dissociation, which is when consciousness splits between different streams of processing. In highway hypnosis, your procedural memory systems are handling all the actual driving while your conscious mind drifts into an entirely different state, often focused on internal thoughts or essentially blank. This is different from being distracted, which is when your conscious attention is diverted to something else. In highway hypnosis, there's essentially no conscious attention active at all. Your brain has entered a state similar to sleepwalking, where complex behaviors are being executed without conscious supervision. Research into highway hypnosis has revealed some disturbing facts about how common and how dangerous this state actually is. Studies using eye tracking and brain imaging technology have shown that experienced drivers enter some degree of highway hypnotic state during approximately 60 to 70% of their highway journeys, lasting more than 30 minutes. That means the majority of long-distance highway driving occurs in an altered state of consciousness, where people are not fully present or aware. This is terrifying when you consider that these same people are controlling vehicles, weighing thousands of pounds traveling at highway speeds. But what makes highway hypnosis particularly relevant to our discussion of road encounters is what happens when something unexpected occurs while you're in this state. When a novel stimulus appears, something that requires conscious attention to process, your brain has to perform an emergency transition from the hypnotic state back to full consciousness. This transition doesn't happen instantaneously. Research shows it can take anywhere from 2 to 5 seconds for full conscious processing to come back online after highway hypnosis. Those seconds might not sound like much, but at highway speeds, they represent hundreds of feet of travel during which you're not capable of making complex decisions or taking appropriate action. This delay in returning to full consciousness explains many of the seemingly irrational responses people have during highway encounters. They're not consciously choosing to react poorly or to freeze or to make questionable decisions. They're trying to respond to an emergency situation while their brain is still in the process of transitioning out of an altered state of consciousness. It's roughly equivalent to being woken up suddenly from deep sleep and being expected to immediately handle a complex crisis. You're not operating at full capacity, and mistakes are essentially inevitable. There's also a more disturbing variation of this phenomenon that occurs specifically in high-stress highway encounters. When something genuinely threatening or incomprehensible appears on a highway, some people enter what's called an acute dissociative state, which is a psychological defense mechanism where consciousness essentially checks out as a way of protecting itself from overwhelming trauma. People in acute dissociative states describe the experience as feeling like they're watching themselves from outside their body, like everything is happening in slow motion or seems unreal, like they're actors in a movie rather than participants in actual events. This dissociative response is the brain's way of creating psychological distance from an experience that's too overwhelming to process in real time. But the problem is that while you're dissociated, your decision-making capacity is severely compromised. You're not really present in the situation, which means you're not capable of responding appropriately. You might make choices that seem bizarre in retrospect, like continuing to drive past someone who clearly needed help, or like taking unnecessary risks that put yourself in danger. These aren't conscious decisions. They're the result of your consciousness being partially offline as a protective mechanism. The long-term psychological consequences of dissociative highway encounters can be severe. When you experience something while in a dissociative state, the memory of that event is encoded differently than normal memories. It often becomes fragmented, with some aspects remembered with unusual clarity while others are completely blank. The emotional content of the memory might be disconnected from the factual content, leading to situations where you remember what happened but can't quite connect with how you felt about it, or vice versa. These fragmented memories are difficult for the brain to process and integrate, which is why people often become obsessed with highway encounters, constantly trying to make sense of memories that don't quite fit together properly. Understanding our vulnerability to protect ourselves. We've covered an enormous amount of psychological territory in this exploration, so let's bring all these threads together and understand what they reveal about highways, human nature, and how we can protect ourselves from the unique vulnerabilities that roads create. What we've discovered is that highways represent a nearly perfect storm of psychological vulnerabilities. They induce cognitive autopilot states that reduce our conscious awareness. They create liminal psychological spaces that make us more susceptible to unusual experiences and misperception. They trigger bystander effects that discourage helping behavior. They force split-second moral decisions that override our ethical reasoning. They induce hypnotic and dissociative states that disconnect us from our own experiences. Each of these factors individually would create significant psychological vulnerability. Combined, they transform highways into environments where even psychologically healthy, intelligent, well-intentioned people become prone to making poor decisions and experiencing lasting psychological trauma. But understanding these vulnerabilities isn't meant to make you paranoid about driving. It's meant to give you the knowledge you need to counteract these effects and make better decisions when unexpected situations arise. The first and most important step is simple awareness. When you understand that your brain naturally enters reduced consciousness states during highway driving, you can take active steps to maintain fuller awareness. This means taking regular breaks on long drives, actively engaging your conscious mind by narrating what you see or having meaningful conversations, and being especially vigilant during times when highway hypnosis is most likely, which includes early morning, late night, and during monotonous stretches of road. The second crucial insight is about moral decision-making. Now that you understand that split-second moral decisions essentially bypass your ethical reasoning, you can prepare in advance for common highway dilemmas. Think through scenarios before you encounter them. What would you do if you saw someone who appeared to need help? Under what circumstances would you stop versus calling authorities? What would constitute suspicious enough behavior that you'd report it even if you weren't completely certain? By thinking through these scenarios when you're not under time pressure, you create mental templates that your autopilot systems can access during actual emergencies, increasing the likelihood that your actions will align with your values even under extreme pressure. The third important takeaway involves the bystander effect in reporting behavior. Understanding that everyone else on the highway is likely experiencing the same psychological vulnerabilities you are should actually increase your likelihood of taking action. Don't assume someone else will report suspicious activity or stop to help someone in need. Assume that you might be the only person who will take action, because psychological research suggests that's often the case. Modern technology makes this easier than ever before. You can report concerning situations to authorities while continuing to drive safely, and doing so might make the critical difference in someone's safety or in solving a serious crime. The fourth insight relates to dissociation and trauma processing. If you experience something disturbing on a highway, understand that your brain might have processed it in an altered state, which means your memories and emotional responses might not align the way they normally would. This doesn't mean you're broken or weak. It means you experienced something that triggered protective psychological mechanisms. If you find yourself obsessing over a highway encounter, experiencing intrusive thoughts, or struggling with guilt over decisions you made in the moment, these are signs that you might benefit from talking to a mental health professional who understands trauma and dissociative experiences. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that the psychological vulnerabilities created by highway driving aren't individual failings. They're systemic issues that affect virtually everyone, and that our society has largely failed to address. We've built a transportation infrastructure that requires people to operate complex machinery for extended periods while in altered states of consciousness. Then we judge them harshly when they make poor decisions or fail to help others under extreme time pressure. This is fundamentally unjust and counterproductive. What we need instead is a broader cultural understanding of these psychological realities. We need to stop treating highway encounters as simple moral tests that reveal people's true character, and start recognizing them as complex psychological situations where even good people will often fail to act optimally. We need better systems for reporting and responding to highway incidents that account for witness uncertainty and psychological barriers to coming forward. We need public awareness campaigns that educate drivers about highway hypnosis, dissociative states, and the bystander effect, so people can recognize and counteract these vulnerabilities in themselves. We also need to acknowledge that unsolved highway mysteries and crimes often remain unsolved, not because there weren't witnesses, but because those witnesses experienced psychological states that prevented them from recognizing the significance of what they saw or discouraged them from reporting it. Every mysterious highway encounter, every unexplained disappearance, every unsolved crime that occurred on or near a road should be investigated with full awareness that potential witnesses might have been in altered cognitive states that affected their perception, memory, and decision-making. The highways we drive on every single day are not the safe, mundane environments we imagine them to be. They're psychologically complex spaces where our normal cognitive processes are disrupted, where our moral decision-making is compromised, and where we're uniquely vulnerable to both genuine threats and to experiences that will haunt us long after the moment has passed. But armed with understanding of these vulnerabilities, we can take steps to protect ourselves and others. We can maintain better awareness, make more ethical decisions under pressure, overcome bystander effects to take action, and process traumatic experiences more effectively. The next time you're driving on a highway late at night and something unexpected appears in your headlights, you'll understand what's happening in your brain. You'll recognize the cognitive autopilot being disrupted, the liminal space psychology making the experience feel unreal, the time pressure forcing split-second decisions, the potential for dissociation if the situation is overwhelming enough. And with that understanding, you'll be better equipped to respond appropriately, to trust your perceptions, to take action when it's needed, and to forgive yourself if your response wasn't perfect. Because the truth is that highways reveal our vulnerabilities, but they also reveal our capacity to overcome them when we truly understand what we're facing. So drive safely, stay aware, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, don't assume someone else will take action, and remember that the mysterious figure in your headlights might be someone whose life depends on whether you can overcome your psychological autopilot long enough to help. The highways are waiting, and now you understand exactly what they demand of everyone who travels them.